All right, for our next family, we're going to talk about the Acipenseridae, or the sturgeons, which is a very cool family. They're all cool, but these guys are extra cool, old school cool. And so now we are in the superclass Gnathostomata. So we've already talked about the jawless fishes. Everybody from here on out is going to have jaws. And within this superclass, today we're going to talk about the class Actinopterygiae. And then within this class, we're going to talk about the subclass Chondrosteae. And if you remember, chondrichthyes are the cartilaginous fish. Chondrosteae, think cartilage. These fish have cartilage. So we're talking about sturgeons and paddlefish. So they're in the bony fish family. Their bones are not typical bones like we're used to. And so these are very easy to identify because of their very unique appearance. They've got a very long snout. They've got a heterocircle tail. And their mouth is extremely inferior. It's behind their eyes and way underneath their head. They don't have typical cycloid or ctenoid scales. They have what are called scutes, which is, my understanding, it's kind of a ganoid type scale. And this is a term that's also used for things like turtles and that. Anytime you have a heavier, more armor-like scale, sometimes they call it scutes. And in the sturgeon, that's what we call them. And so, of course, here's a sturgeon, and you can see that snout. And the scutes tend to run down the sides and down the back. And they're very uniquely shaped, and they don't really overlap. And then, of course, you can see the heterocircle tail here as well. And when you flip them, you see that extreme inferior mouth. It's way behind the eyes, and they're very flat bellies. These fish are very well designed for a life on the bottom of rivers, and they can suck up worms and things out of the sand. So in Kentucky, we have 3 species of sturgeon: the lake sturgeon, Acipenseridae fulvescens; the shovel-nosed sturgeon, Scaphorhynchus platyrhynchus; and then also in the Scaphorhynchus genus, we have the pallid sturgeon, Scaphorhynchus albus. So all these fish are big river fish. They're well designed for living at the bottoms of big rivers, and that's where we tend to find them. You're not going to find these in Kentucky Lake. Part of me thinks that that's why they've been able to stick around for so long. These fish have been around for, what, 100 million years? And I have this hypothesis that part of that reason is because they are well adapted to live at the bottoms of big rivers, and there's always big rivers. So they always have appropriate habitat. That's just something I have always thought. They all live a long time. 100 years is probably not out of the question. Some of the fish have been aged at more than 100 years. And because they live so long, they take a long time to reach sexual maturity. 10 to 20 years maybe before they're first sexually mature. And then they only spawn every 4 or 5 years after that. So their life strategy is slow and steady. They take a long time to reach sexual maturity. They only have babies every once in a while. They live a long time. When it's time to spawn, they can go on very long spawning migrations. And I say 100 plus kilometers, but probably even way longer than this. Just to give you an example, so this is a tagged pallid sturgeon that we tracked back in the day. And if you look at this map here, this is a map of the Mississippi River. And it's from where the Missouri flows in down all the way to the confluence of the Mississippi and the Ohio. So this is what's called the open river, or the middle Mississippi River. And we tagged this fish on March 26th at river mile 80. And then we detected it moving upstream. And so you see where it was on April 8th, and then on April 13th, and April 16th. And then we detected it even further upstream on May 10th. And this is all significant because you can see that what I've indicated with an arrow here is a big riffle, a natural riffle in the river that's been there forever, and that's always been a presumed spawning area or historical spawning area for these pallid sturgeon. And so that's why we were watching for these fish, because we thought that's where they were going to spawn. And you'll see that after May 10th, we caught it again the 25th of May going back downstream, and then just a couple days later it was way back downstream at mile 44. And so this gives you an idea. Again, this fish traveled way upstream probably to spawn, and then it was heading back downstream. So the lake sturgeon is a very cool fish. They're also called rubber nose because of the shape of their nose. They've got this rounded nose that's really obvious. And if you look at a picture here, this is a small lake sturgeon. You can see that rounded nose. Whereas the Scaphorhynchus, the shovel nose and the pallid sturgeon have a shovel-shaped nose or a flatter nose. So the shape of the snout is a dead giveaway. You also have smooth barbels on the lake sturgeon. So think about a smooth lake, calm lake, and it's the lake sturgeon that has the smooth barbels. And here's a picture of that. And they also have a spiracle, and I mentioned a spiracle earlier. This is just an opening on top of the head that allows more water into the gill chamber. And that's just another characteristic of the lake sturgeon. These are very large fish. The largest on record, about 2.4 meters, 122 kilograms. They live a long time, they're huge, and they're gorgeous. And so that's why it's just such a cool fish, right? Here's a small lake sturgeon. There's a nice laker. Here's a laker that was stranded and returned to the river. Now, Kentucky has in the past tried to reintroduce lake sturgeon into the upper Cumberland River. And so if you kind of orient yourself, this is above Cumberland Lake. This is over on the east end of the state. And in 1954, there's a good historical record of lake sturgeon. It's like the last record of lake sturgeon in the Cumberland River. And so that's why they're trying to reintroduce them. Sturgeon are in big trouble all over the world. And we'll talk about why here in a second, but this is why we're really concerned about sturgeon, and they need all the help we can get. And a big part of that help these days is trying to reintroduce them to where they were found naturally. And this is what's going on in the east side of Kentucky. So perhaps one of these might show up in Barkley or Kentucky someday, because they can move that far. That would be very interesting, but those lakes are not good habitat for them in general. Okay, in our other genus, we've got the shovel nose and the pallid. Shovel nose are also called hacklebacks or hacks. And the pallid is a closely related species, and this is the federally endangered sturgeon that we have here in Kentucky. And so there's a lot of protection and a lot of concern about this species. So you will probably never run into a pallid sturgeon in your life. I really wish you would, but they're super rare. But if you ever do, I want you to be prepared so you can recognize it, because they are such an important fish. As their name suggests, they're more pallid, they're whiter, they're pale colored. But color is, as you'll see here, it's very difficult sometimes to tell these two apart. They have a much larger snout, and they get bigger than the shovel nose. Now, as I said, the pallid sturgeon is a federally endangered species, so it's well protected. Lake sturgeon are state endangered, and so this is not a fish that you can keep if you ever catch one. You got to turn them loose. But the lake sturgeon populations are doing better up north. Missouri has been stocking lake sturgeon in the river for a long time, and there's evidence that they're starting to reproduce again. Um, which is a big deal because lake sturgeon were extirpated from the Mississippi River, and there wasn't a lake sturgeon seen in that river since the early 20th century, 1920s maybe. They completely disappeared from the river, and now we're starting to catch more, and they actually might be reproducing in the Mississippi River. That's a big deal. And up north in Wisconsin, there is a lot of effort that goes into protecting these fish. They're not as common down here, but we're also very concerned and we're trying to protect them. That's lake sturgeon. Pallid sturgeon, of course, is federally endangered. There's lots of protection. Another way that, again, actually going back to something I mentioned earlier, the lake sturgeon, think of the smooth lake, has the smooth barbels, which you see here on the left, and the Scaphorhynchus have the fringed barbels, and you can see the fringes on the barbels here in the picture on the right. So it's a pallid or a shovel nose. Now here we're comparing a pallid to a shovel nose, and you can see the pallid is bulkier, which is generally true. You see the snout is larger and more pointed in the pallid sturgeon. You see that pallid is a little bit wider. If you flip them over, the pallid should not have any scales on its belly, whereas the shovel nose does. And if you look at the insertion of the barbels, where those barbels attach, it's different between these two species. And so in the shovel nose, the base of those barbels is straight across, whereas in the pallid, it's more curved. The outer barbels are further toward the tail. And the way I try to remember this is I think of the D in pallid. And so the barbels make sort of a D shape if you kind of turn your head and look, whereas in the shovel nose, they don't make that D shape. So that hopefully will help you too. The problem is that there's lots of hybridization going on between these two species. And so the hybrids have intermediate characteristics. And so you pick up a fish, it might look a little like a pallid, but a little like a shovel nose, and you're not really sure. It could be a hybrid, but it also could be that the alleles from one species are introgressing into the other. Again, a lot of this has to do with the destruction of their habitat in the big rivers. Once the dams were produced, it changed the flow of the rivers. You lost a lot of that natural spawning habitat for the sturgeon. So they're all forced to spawn in the same areas that are very rare. And so you tend to get a lot of hybridization. And so that is a big concern because you could you might breed the pallid out of existence. As these two species exchange a lot of genetic material, at some point they might just become one species, and that's a big concern. And again, as I mentioned, IDing them can become difficult. More recently, something that's occurred to help the pallid a little bit is that the shovel nose is listed where it's sympatric with the pallid. And so an interesting thing about the pallids is that they're found in the lower Mississippi, which is below the confluence with the Ohio, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. From the Ohio up to the Missouri, that's the middle Mississippi, and they're found there. But they're not found in the upper Mississippi, which is upstream from the Missouri. But the pallids are found all the way up the Missouri River. And so anywhere where that pallid is found, the shovel nose is now also protected and can't be fished for, because there used to be a significant commercial fishery for the shovel nose, but consequently people were taking a lot of pallids because they're so hard to tell apart. And there's a provision in the Endangered Species Act that says you can list a non-endangered species if by taking that species you're very likely to take an endangered species. That's why it's protected. Now, in the upper Mississippi River, there are no pallids, so the shovel nose is not protected. And consequently, that's putting a lot more pressure on the shovel nose because all the fishing effort, the commercial fishing effort, is going on that smaller population of sturgeon. Okay, to introduce a little bit more terminology to kind of clear up the areas we're talking about. What you're looking at here is the Missouri River in red and the Mississippi River in purple. Okay. And now if we look at the Mississippi River, the area that is upstream of the confluence with the Missouri, that's called the Upper Mississippi River, or the UMR. Then if you look at the area between where the Missouri comes in and where the Ohio comes in, that's the Middle Mississippi River. And then anything below the confluence with the Ohio is the Lower Mississippi River. And now if we look at the Upper Mississippi River and the Missouri River, those rivers are dammed and they're not free flowing. Now the reason they're dammed is for navigation. By law, the Corps of Engineers has to keep these rivers a minimum of 9 feet deep. That's like the minimum channel you need to run barges. And the way they do that is to use dams to keep the water deep enough. So both of these, all the Missouri and the Upper Mississippi have a series of dams on there which are used to keep that deep. Now it's also, for flood control and things like that. But these are not free-flowing rivers. Below the confluence with the Missouri, once the Missouri flows into the Mississippi, now you have enough water year-round that you can keep that channel deep enough without any dams. So there are no dams on the Middle Mississippi and the Lower Mississippi, and we call this open river or free-flowing river. And if you look at the Pallid sturgeon range, it's the Lower Mississippi, the Middle Mississippi, and the Missouri, but not the Upper Mississippi. And so wherever the Pallid's found, you can't commercially fish for shovel-nosed sturgeon. They're both shut down. But in the Upper Mississippi, you can commercially fish for shovel-nosed sturgeon. And now, not just the Pallid, not just the shovel nose, not just the laker, but all over the world, this family of fish is imperiled. And a big reason has to do with habitat degradation, which we talked about. Dams are a severe impediment to these fish. Not only does it impede their long spawning migrations, which we talked about, but the dams change the characteristics of the big river. They don't flow like they used to. And so you lose a lot of that shallow, gravelly substrate that a lot of these organisms need for feeding and for spawning. Another reason that the sturgeon are imperiled is because of overfishing. They have very tasty flesh, especially when smoked. And this is our #1 source of high quality caviar. And so the combination of habitat degradation and overfishing has really hurt these species. And so when you talk about caviar, you're usually talking about sturgeon eggs, at least the highest quality caviar. So think about the characteristics of this family. They take a long time to reach maturity, and right when they are old enough to spawn, and they only spawn every few years, right when those eggs are ready to be fertilized, you take the female, you take her eggs. Of course, you kill the female in the process here. And so you can understand how this sort of fishing can really affect a fish like this, because it takes so long for that female to be replaced, because they take so long to reach sexual maturity. Now, the European sturgeon have the best caviar. So if you've ever heard of beluga caviar, that's like the highest quality. That's from the beluga sturgeon, which is an Eastern European sturgeon. And here's a picture of one. And these things are enormous. And so they make very high quality caviar. You can get tons of that. But because of those aforementioned reasons, habitat degradation, overfishing, the Eastern European sturgeon are in really bad shape. That has been putting a lot of pressure on the North American sturgeon because the demand for caviar is still there, and consequently, the fishing pressure has shifted over to the North American sturgeon. So although we don't eat a lot of caviar, I mean, it's not something that's very common on the American's dinner plate, our fish are supplying a lot of that caviar, and that's something we're worried about because those European populations are crashing. And this is just to give you an idea of, I was walking through a shopping mall one time. This is years ago, so this is a very old slide. But there was a kiosk selling just caviar in this shopping mall. I think I was in Florida. And so again, this slide is 10, 15 years old, but you can see the prices per ounce of this caviar. And so $150 an ounce for beluga caviar is something like $2,000 or $3,000 a pound for this caviar. So it's extremely valuable. And so you can understand the incentive from the fisherman's point of view to go ahead and take that fish. Because if you get a giant female like that, you can get several kilograms of caviar out of her at these prices. One fish can be worth a ton of money. That's why there's a huge incentive to overfish these things, which is why we need a counter incentive. We need to make some laws to protect them. Now, you can see here the different grades of caviar. And at the very bottom, you have American Savruga. And I was looking at this and I'm like, American Savruga? What the? There's no Savruga sturgeon. Savruga sturgeon is a European sturgeon. What's American Savruga? American Savruga is actually paddlefish, okay? And you can see it's the cheapest there. So that's the poor man's caviar. But they just give it that fancy name. Okay, so I want to show you a video, some different videos here. The first one is just to show you what that mouth looks like in the sturgeon, and we call it a protrusible mouth. Earlier we called a mouth that went forward protractile. Probably those terms are interchangeable, but this is a unique mouth on that sturgeon, and I want to show that to you real quick. Okay, so this is a shovel nose that I had in a tank for a little bit, and his name was Clyde. And the tank was obviously too small for him, but you get a good look at how that protrusible mouth works. And if you watch it, you can see him extend it. And I've just dropped a bunch of bloodworms that are down in that gravel. And he senses them with those barbels and then uses that mouth like a vacuum to suck them up. And there you can see that mouth extending out like a vacuum. See how those barbels are dragging across the gravel, sensing where the food is. Okay, in this next video, I want to show you a kind of a cool video. This is from a Didson. And what a Didson is an underwater camera that uses acoustic energy to form an image. So it's a hybrid between an underwater camera and a fish finder. And this is very useful for things like the bottom of big rivers, where there's no light and you can't get enough light and you could never see anything with a regular camera, but you can use sound energy to produce a real-time image. And so that's what they were doing. They were just trying to use this Didson to investigate what kind of fish they were finding below one of the dams in the Mississippi River, and you can clearly see a lake sturgeon on this Didson. So here you can see the fish approaching, and again, this is 60, 70 feet down in the Mississippi River, but you can clearly see that that's a lake sturgeon. And I just think that's really cool. And here's a video that talks about the caviar industry in Missouri and just some of the issues with that caviar.
It's peaceful. I've always loved being on the water. Don't get me wrong. It's hard work sometimes. Some days it's not as bad as others. You know, it just depends on what type of fish we're going after and what kind of workload we're really going to be into.
I've been commercial since I was about 18 years old, good 20 years. And all the last, I guess, 5 or 6 years I've got after these hackles. I can't say Kathy's been in it just as much as I have. Well, I do this full time, but this spring is about the only time we fish for caviar on the Missouri. That's just cat background.
The husband and wife team of Cliff and Kathleen Rost are among the few commercial fishermen still working on the Missouri River. They are fishing for sturgeon, an ancient prehistoric fish that has been in these waters for millennia. Sturgeon were reputed to grow to great size. In the past, fish over 300 pounds were not unheard of. But today, the prize is not the fish, but the fish eggs.
And this is how you can tell usually with that black line and a soft belly.
Sturgeon eggs are better known as caviar. To monitor the effect of the growing caviar trade, biologists from the Missouri Department of Conservation are out on the river every spring, keeping a close watch on the sturgeon population.
The reason we're out here sampling today for the Sturgeon Monitoring Project is back in the mid-1990s, the Caspian Sea sturgeon fishery over by Russia and Iran collapsed due to overharvest. And the Caspian Sea sturgeon fishery used to supply 90% of the world's caviar. Since that fishery collapsed, the caviar industry is now refocusing their attention on the sturgeon and paddlefish in the Midwest of the United States here. Caviar, they're the eggs of the sturgeon, and the fish is usually sacrificed for the eggs. And over the last 5 to 6 years, we've seen a huge increase in the harvest, particularly of shovel-nosed sturgeon on the Mississippi River. From 1988 to year 2001, we saw the harvest of shovel-nosed sturgeon increase by over 1,000%.
Missouri has 3 different species of sturgeon. 2 of them, the Pallid sturgeon and the lake sturgeon, are endangered species and may not be taken by fishermen.
Pallid sturgeon, our endangered species, is very difficult to tell apart from shovel-nosed sturgeon. Some inexperienced commercial fishermen and some other commercial fishermen, more unscrupulous commercial fishermen, are actually taking the Pallid sturgeon along with the shovel-nosed sturgeon just because the value of the eggs are so high.
Information gained on the Sturgeon Monitoring Project has been used to create new regulations to manage this important part of our natural heritage.
This one has one.
Regulations that protect our endangered species, that control the effects of the caviar trade, and importantly, that allow individuals like Cliff and Kathleen Rost to continue the tradition of commercial fishing on the Missouri River.
We've traditionally worked with commercial fishermen quite a bit. With the new regulations, we're trying to find a balance with the commercial fishermen. We're trying to maintain the population and still let them fish. The new regulations that have just gone into effect include a season on shovel-nosed sturgeon, which runs from November 1st through May 15th. And then we also have a harvest limit, which actually limits commercial fishermen. They can only take shovel-nosed sturgeon from 24 to 30 inches in length. We'll also have a closed zone on the Missouri River, which will run from Jefferson City down the chamois access. And then the last thing is commercial fishermen will also need a shovel nose sturgeon permit. We're hoping to reduce the harvest, the take of shovel nose sturgeon through those regulations. You guys catching some sturgeon today?
Catching a few.
Catching a few?
Not a good day, but it'll work.
Have they started to run yet?
Not hard, no.
Not yet?
No. You know, I'm doing this for a living, so I mean, there's got to be some control on it, you know, because I want to be able to continue fishing, you know. I want to pop up here in a year and say, oh no, we're just going to take them away. That's my concern, but I think with proper regulation on it, shouldn't be any problem.
All right, that's a lot of information about the sturgeon. So let me know if you got any questions. See ya.